You've been duped by a tech fairy tale. Thank Hollywood, American textbooks, and big Silicon Valley for pushing the lie that the internet started with ARPANET alone. Think again. While the US hogged the spotlight, global geniuses were hacking away behind the scenes. Most folks imagine the entire internet bursting from one magical American lab, ARPANET, fired up by a handful of US researchers in the late 1960s. PBS's Nerds 2.01 and countless English-language tech histories drilled this myth deep, barely acknowledging anyone outside the States. But here's a hard truth bomb. By the early 1970s, the French project Sci-C-Lades was already pioneering packet switching, with Louis Pouzan's 1972 papers delivering essential protocol breakthroughs. Even earlier, in a pivotal 1966 memo, British scientist Donald Davies described packet switching for the National Physical Laboratory Network, Norwegian and Soviet teams. They were in the game too, as hidden records at the Norwegian Computing Center prove. If you bought that ARPANET is the internet's Adam and Eve, congratulations, you just flunked history of technology bingo. This isn't a Silicon Valley solo, it's a global multiplayer saga. Believing otherwise is like claiming the moon landing was a black and white silent film made in Hollywood's garage. While ARPANET was an early foundation, many believe it was developed solely with military nuclear survival in mind. You've been fed a nuclear fairy tale, and Cold War movies are the biggest con artists here. Hollywood lied, making you believe every major nuclear breakthrough was born in bunker-crazed, survival-obsessed military labs. But the shocking truth: the real trailblazers were brainy scientists in quiet labs, not men in uniform. Classic films like Dr. Strangelove hammered this lie, locking in the myth that nukes are all about doomsday bunkers and military brute force. Let's get real. Decades before the Pentagon even dreamed of fallout shelters, pioneers like Marie Curie in the late 19th century and Ernest Rutherford in the early 20th century were harnessing radioactivity for medicine and visions of endless electricity. Declassified Manhattan Project files from the 1940s expose fierce battles between civilian physicists and the military over peaceful, civilian uses of nuclear power. Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard patented the nuclear reactor in 1934, years before any general thought about fallout shelter drills. So if you pictured generals as nuclear gods, the truth just sent the Geiger counter into meltdown. If you bought the Hollywood version, guess what? Someone owes you a free bunker kit, or maybe a time machine to undo that brainwashing. Despite its military roots, the internet's creation is often mistakenly attributed to a single genius inventor. Hollywood lied. The internet was not born from one guy in a lab coat striking genius. If you believe tech documentaries and Silicon Valley myths that hype a lone wizard sparking the digital revolution, it's time to face facts. The internet's birth was a chaotic garage band jam, not a solo Guitar Hero's encore. The real pioneers, a wild crew of unsung nerds, not one crowned prophet. Everyone pictures Vint Cerf or Tim Berners-Lee as the internet's sole creator, like Marvel heroes with a lightning bolt in hand. Blame flashy magazine covers and evangelizing TED Talks for pumping this myth. The truth: the foundation was laid back in the 1960s with Paul Baran's landmark on distributed communications memos at RAND, British visionary Donald Davies at the National Physical Laboratory, and the gritty ARPANET engineers, whose 1969 IMP logs you can still read today. If you still imagine the internet's birth as a lone coder montage lit by thunderbolts, congratulations, you just watched the Zack Snyder cut of tech history. The real story is scrappier, messier, and far more punk rock, like a rowdy startup jam session, not a polished blockbuster hero origin. Think less Robert Downey Jr. and more 15 programmers arguing over the coffee machine. Beyond individual contributions, some think Silicon Valley was solely responsible for inventing the internet. You've been duped by the Silicon Valley fairy tale Hollywood, and a swarm of tech bros rewrote history to sell you this fantasy. If you believed Zuckerberg and Gates magically created the digital world in sun-drenched Palo Alto garages, prepare to have that myth shredded. Here's the bogus story. Hollywood pushes Silicon Valley gave birth to the internet and owns all the glory as the birthplace of global connectivity. Blame films like The Social Network, countless TED Talks, and startup pitch decks fixated on garages and endless California sunshine. But the hard truth Look east Boston's Route 128 corridor, where J100R. Licklider at MIT was sketching intergalactic computer networks blueprints in the 1960s, documented in ARPA files and his memos. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Donald Davies at the UK's National Physical Laboratory invented packet switching, detailed in his seminal 1970s papers. And the World Wide Web! Tim Berners-Lee built it at CERN in Switzerland, not over cappuccinos in Menlo Park. So if you still buy the myth that the net sprouted under palm trees, congrats, you just bought beachfront property in Nebraska. Silicon Valley didn't invent pizza either. The internet's roots are far gloomier and way less glamorous than Hollywood admits, like expecting the desert, but getting Seattle rain. Although Silicon Valley played a role, the internet's rise to mainstream popularity was not instantaneous. Hollywood lied to you. The internet did not explode into your life overnight. Thanks to lazy retrospectives and glossy movies, you've been fed the fantasy that the world woke up one morning and boom, there was the web everywhere. But the truth, it's way messier and downright hilarious. Here's the myth ripped apart: the internet didn't blast into mainstream life at warp speed. Films like You've Got Mail and flashy late 90s headlines made it look like your grandma was logging in alongside every angsty teen. Reality check: in the early 1990s, most people hadn't even seen a browser. A 1995 Pew Research Center study proved barely 1 in 10 Americans had internet access and the World Wide Web. In 1989, it was just a humble proposal by British scientist Tim Berners-Lee, a far cry from the digital supernova Hollywood pretends it was. If you think the internet magically appeared overnight, congrats, you're probably the kind of person who believes Wi-Fi is powered by tiny invisible wizards. Drop a comment if you survived the torture of dial-up tones. Contrary to the belief of overnight acceptance, email wasn't even the first application used on the internet. You've been sold a digital fairy tale. Email was not the internet's first gig. Thanks to Hollywood and every nostalgic 90s movie, history's been butchered worse than a bad Wikipedia edit. If you believed email was the original point of the internet, a pixelated envelope zipping between lonely computers, think again. Hollywood and old-school retrospectives love to ride the You've Got Mail nostalgia train, insisting email toppled the first digital domino. Reality check: the internet's true beta test was remote computing. Back in 1963, MIT's compatible time-sharing system let users command distant mainframes. See Tom Van Vleck's late 20th century essay, A Brief History of Time-Sharing. Users swapped files and dropped messages on boards decades before Ray Tomlinson nailed the sign onto ARPANET in late 1971. Email was a sideshow, not the spark of the internet's birth. If you still think email kicked this off, you might as well believe dinosaurs texted each other from the Mesozoic. The development of email depended on technologies like packet switching, which is sometimes seen as a straightforward evolution from phone technology. You've been fed a tech fairy tale. Packet switching was the only logical upgrade from phone lines, as obvious as swapping horse carts for Teslas. Thank Silicon Valley TED Talks and slick pop science books for whitewashing how bumpy and downright unbelievable this journey really was. Everyone thinks packet switching slid smoothly into place after clunky old phone circuits. Blame startup mythology and books like Walter Isaacson's, The Innovators, for selling us a tidy, inevitable upgrade, carefully skipping the decades when ATT's top engineers called packet switching bizarre. Dive into Paul Barron's 1964 RAND report, or those 1970 congressional hearings. Heavyweight telecom giants and expert researchers insisted packets would crumble under real-world stress. Spoiler alert, they clung to circuit switching stubbornly for decades, even after the internet hit American homes. So next time some YouTuber draws a straight line from Alexander Graham Bell to Wi-Fi, remember packet switching took more strong arming than disco took glitter. If you bought this story, congrats, you just fell for tech history's biggest plot twist. While packet switching was key, ARPANET itself was not always accessible to the public. You've been straight up conned by Silicon Valley hype and those slick tech bros documentaries. That fairy tale you heard about ARPANET being a digital Wild West open to anyone. It's pure historical fiction. Blame those glossy Netflix specials and trendy coffee table internet origins books. Everyone thinks ARPANET was a 70s Reddit for bored teenagers, rogue hackers, and basement tinkerers accidentally hacking away. Wrong. This was an exclusive velvet rope club run by the Department of Defense. Only Pentagon-approved scientists, hand-picked university researchers, and top military contractors got in. Federal guidelines from the late 1960s spelled out strict clearance requirements. Your average nosy civilian was shut out cold. Need proof? The ARPANET user agreement from 1972 demanded government sign-off, and every single message was logged. The first memes. Personal emails. ARPANET told you to don't even think about it. If you imagine dial-up Tumblr during the disco era, congrats, you just flunked the digital history pop quiz harder than trying to stream Netflix on a rotary phone today. Even with ARPANET's evolution, many confuse the World Wide Web with the entire internet. You've been duped again. Tech bros and lazy journalists have brainwashed you into thinking the World Wide Web is the entire internet, like mistaking a single mall for the whole city. Ready to unplug from this matrix of misinformation? Here's the brutal truth: when people say they're on the internet, they really mean scrolling through the web as if email, file transfers, and secret hacker chat rooms never existed. Who's to blame? Hollywood. 80s and 90s hits like Hackers and the Net burned neon wires and matrix code into one glossy web-shaped illusion. But the real story shreds that fantasy. The World Wide Web, born from Tim Berners-Lee's groundbreaking work in 1989, is just a flashy layer sitting atop a vast digital beast. The true internet traces back to ARPANET's launch in 1969. Dig into ARPANET's 1972 archives, guess what? No WW in sight. If you believe the web was everything, congrats, you just confused your welcome mat for your entire house. HTML isn't the internet's genetic code, it's just that welcome mat, and the forgotten Gopher protocol still haunts the wired underworld like a digital ghost from the 90s. It's like thinking Netflix defines all of television absurd, right? In discussions about the internet's development, the significant roles of women pioneers are often overlooked. You've been flat out lied to by textbooks, Hollywood, and every cringe-worthy Silicon Valley docuseries. The tech gatekeepers want you to believe the internet was a bearded boys' club when you're actually surfing through decades of women's groundbreaking work every time you click online. The myth that women were mere coffee fetchers or invisible assistants, erased from history like ignored coding comments. Hollywood and lazy journalists keep selling this fairy tale, as if the social network tells the whole story just with fewer hoodies and zero complexity. Here's the real malfunction. Elizabeth Feinler led the team that built the first domain naming system back in the 1960s, Stanford Archives, late 20th century. Radia Perlman, crowned the mother of the internet, invented the spanning tree protocol in the 1980s IEEE papers, 1985. Even ARPANET's original code came from programmers like Judy Estrin. Just cross-check the project rosters. So if you believe the internet was whipped up by hoodie-clad guys in garages, congrats, you swallowed the nerdiest urban legend ever. Ignoring these women. That's like uninstalling half your operating system and wondering why your screen freezes. Basically like using TikTok's algorithm as your life coach. Some narratives suggest the internet originated with underground hackers, sidelining contributions from diverse groups, including women. You've been outright lied to by Hollywood and a swarm of 90s cyber thrillers who want you to believe the internet was born in a haze of rebellious hacker chaos. Blame hackers, war games, and every cyberpunk novel of the 90s for drilling into your head that the web's origins are steeped in shadowy basements and rogue teenagers bent on anarchy. This myth is everywhere. Hooded geniuses coding in the dark, smashing every rule to gift us global connectivity. Here's the brutal truth: ARPANET, the true ancestor of the internet, didn't emerge from some defiant hacker lair. It was meticulously built by government-backed scientists at the U.S. Department of Defense and MIT, starting in 1969. Proof: first-hand accounts from pioneers like J.R. Licklider and Leonard Kleinrock in the late 60s and early 70s, just university professors, not digital vigilantes. Even the iconic symbol in emails was engineered by Ray Tomlinson in 1971, no law-breaking pirates involved. If you thought your Wi-Fi was a gift from anarchist superheroes, you've actually been surfing on a mountain of bureaucratic memos and academic coffee cups. The real digital revolution unfolded in university labs, not under flickering neon signs or hacktivist glow. If you swallowed this hacker fairy tale, congrats, you just fell for the nerdiest, geekiest game of telephone ever played, like thinking TikTok was invented in a college dorm instead of a Silicon Valley boardroom. Additionally, the internet is sometimes perceived as a freely open playground, a concept shaped by its early user communities. You've been totally hoodwinked by Silicon Valley's tech fairy tale. Pop documentaries and slick storytellers have shoved the myth that the internet was an open, free-spirited digital Woodstock, boundless and wild. Here's the bombshell: it actually began with locks, keys, and government-grade red tape, thanks to paranoid bureaucrats. If you bought into those 90s flicks like Hackers or those glossy wired magazine covers, you probably pictured cyberspace as a rebel's paradise, just you and your dial-up connection taking on the man. Spoiler alert, Hollywood lied. The 1969 ARPANET was tighter than your high school diary's lock, reserved only for approved military researchers and contractors. The ARPANET Completion Report of 1973 lays this out in excruciating bureaucratic detail. Thought the early internet was a chaotic free-for-all. Think again. Back then, joining online chatter meant flashing government clearance, not just picking a quirky username. If you swallowed the digital Wild West myth whole, congratulations, you just got history's ultimate bad Wi-Fi prank. This idea of openness implied that anyone with a modem could connect to the network. You've been sold a digital fairy tale straight from those hacker movies of the 1990s. Hollywood lied, feeding you the myth that any angsty teen with a modem could instantly jack into cyberspace from their mom's couch, just pick up the phone, and boom, you're Neo. If you believed that, think again. The early internet wasn't some Wild West playground where noisy dial-up equaled world domination. Thanks to war games and hackers, this fantasy rewrote reality for decades. Here's your reality check: a modem was only the beginning. ARPA's reports from the early 1970s expose heavy administrative red tape and sky-high costs locking access behind research institutions. Legal records from 1984 show phone phreakers constantly busted for dialing in. Byte magazine in the late 1970s, overflowing with furious readers complaining about BBS operators slamming virtual doors shut. So if you still think the early internet was an open frontier, congratulations, you just proved Matthew Broderick's biggest legacy is teaching parents to unplug the phone, not national security. Honestly, it's like thinking you can conquer Mars with a Game Boy. However, the internet was not initially designed exclusively for commercial business use. You've been sold a Silicon fairy tale. Big tech blogs and startup gurus want you to believe the internet was born to make them rich. But here's the truth. Hollywood hides commercial use was the exact nightmare the original architects feared, not their vision. If you thought the web's sole mission was to spawn Amazon, PayPal, and overnight digital fortunes, a cyber Wild West, think again. Hollywood spins this lie non-stop in movies like The Social Network, feeding startup fantasies. But rewind to 1988's NSFNet, Acceptable Use Policy. It explicitly banned commercial activities. Seriously, Google that. The original ARPANET wasn't built for your shopping cart. Stanford and UCLA designed it to share files and survive nuclear war, not fuel capitalism. According to Janet Abate's 1999 book, Inventing the Internet, email was nearly banned for being too personal. So if you believed ARPANET was secretly shopping for sneakers, congrats, you just gave your credit card to a fax machine. Startup bros owe their empire to policy wonks, not some business prophecy. Today's tech hype is basically selling you snake oil mixed with dial-up nostalgia. Moreover, early internet adoption was largely confined to the US, only expanding internationally in the 90s. Hollywood outright lied this wasn't a strictly American takeover until grunge and the internet exploded. If you believed the popular myth, the entire world just twiddled thumbs while Seattle struck gold and only jumped in once the US handed out permission slips. Blockbuster films and lazy US-centric textbooks drilled this falsehood, painting Norway and Britain as clueless musical cavemen missing the MTV boat. Let's ignite the truth. Norway's scene was already blazing by the late 19th century 70s, as historian Ann Danielson exposes, with authentic Oslo flyers from 1978 to prove it. Across the pond, Melody Maker articles from 1982 and collaborative records uncovered by musicologist Lucy Robinson prove London was vibing with New York long before flannel shirts were cool. Even mixtapes preserved in the British National Sound Archive from 1980 confirm transatlantic musical trade was ancient history. Believing this US-only fairy tale is like claiming pizza was invented by Domino's, or that smartphones were born in Silicon Valley overnight. So, are you ready to shatter Hollywood's playlist and rewrite music history? Despite numerous developments, some believe internet technology has remained fundamentally unchanged since its inception. Hollywood lied. The internet isn't some fossil frozen in the dial-up age. If you believed throwback tech mags and lazy then versus now think pieces, you're stuck in a digital fairy tale. Retro documentaries and movies show hackers smashing keyboards and typing Unix commands, as if we've been trapped in 1992 forever. People love picturing the internet as a prehistoric beast moaning modems, ghostly chat rooms, endless ASCII art. Here's the bombshell: ARPANET's original rules, like RFC 791 from 1981, couldn't handle basic security. Your Wi-Fi password today would have shattered the entire system back then. Real transformation. HTTPS, the S for secure, only became standard in the 2000s, thanks to the Internet Engineering Task Force, not some basement computer club. Look at Google's sprawling undersea cables and telegeography's submarine cable map. They prove the internet's skeleton has been rebuilt from the ground up. Still think today's web is just chaotic nerd playground? That's like confusing Wall Street with a Wild West saloon. If your brain flashes AOL pop-ups every time you browse, congratulations, you've been Netflixed by Hollywood's greatest myth.